I spent 20 years hiding in the mountains to escape a past that was officially erased. But tonight, the blizzard brought the truth to my doorstep, and it looked exactly like the person who had died in the fire 2 decades ago. Now, with a tracker in my hand and a tactical team closing in, I realized that I wasn't just a survivor of an organized scheme. I was the bait they had been waiting for all along. The blizzard wasn't just snow. It was a physical wall of white rage, howling against the walls of my cabin like a living thing trying to get in. I lived miles from the nearest town, deep in the mountains where the silence was usually a comfort, but tonight it felt suffocating. I was nursing a lukewarm coffee by the fireplace when the sound hit me, a rhythmic, desperate pounding on the front door. I froze. Nobody came up this mountain in January, and certainly not after midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled the heavy deadbolt, half expecting a stray deer or a branch knocked loose by the gale. Instead, I found her. She was slumped against the threshold, her coat coated in a thick, frozen crust of ice, her hair matted with frost. She looked like she had walked out of a ghost story. I didn't think. I just hauled her inside, the wind screaming past us as I slammed the door shut and engaged the locks. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clicked like percussion. I threw a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, stoked the fire until the logs groaned with heat, and pushed a mug of steaming tea into her trembling hands. She didn't speak for a long time. She just stared into the embers, her eyes wide, glassy, and unfocused. When she finally looked at me, the gratitude in her gaze was overshadowed by a frantic, jagged fear. "You shouldn't have opened the door," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "They'll be here soon." I tried to soothe her, telling her the storm would keep anyone away, but she just shook her head, her fingernails digging into the fabric of the blanket. She looked like someone who had spent the last week running from something that didn't have a name. I went to the kitchen to find some dry towels, and that's when I saw it. Her purse, a battered leather satchel, had spilled onto the floorboards when I'd helped her inside. A small, weathered envelope lay open, and a photograph had slid out. It was a black and white picture, curled at the edges, depicting a group of people standing in front of a building that looked hauntingly familiar. My blood went cold. It was the old logging mill at the base of this very mountain, a mill that had burned to the ground 20 years ago. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. In the center of the photo, standing among the men, was a young woman who looked exactly like the person shivering by my fire. Not just similar, it was her. The same jagged scar running through her left eyebrow, the same distinct star-shaped birthmark on her wrist. But there was a problem. That mill had been the center of a massive investigation back in the 90s, involving an organized scheme that had torn our community apart. The people in that photo were the primary subjects of a federal probe, a group that had been wiped off the map, officially declared dead in the fire, or sent away for an enormous term. My hands shook as I picked up the photo. The woman by the fire was not a day older than the girl in the picture, yet the date scrawled on the back of the print was 1994. I looked back at her. She was watching me, her expression shifting from terror to a cold, calculated stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. She knew I had seen it. She stood up, her shivering gone, and she wasn't looking at me like a victim anymore. She reached into her coat pocket, and for a terrifying second, I thought she was pulling out a piece of a legal weapon. But instead, she held up a small, flickering device, a tracker. "You don't understand," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "I didn't come here to hide. I came here because you were the only witness they couldn't find. And now that you've seen my face, we're both marked for a permanent silence." Just as she spoke, the front window shattered, and red laser dots began dancing across my living room wall. The sound of the glass shattering wasn't a crack. It was an explosion of jagged diamonds that showered the floor, followed immediately by the suffocating roar of the storm rushing into the room. I dove behind the heavy oak sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The red laser dots weren't just decorative. They were sweeping the room with lethal precision, carving lines through the dust motes dancing in the firelight. Beside me, the woman, the girl from the photograph who shouldn't have aged a day, didn't cower. She moved with a fluid, predatory grace, pressing her back against the brickwork of the fireplace. Her eyes were locked on the window, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flash of something in her hand that made my breath hitch. It wasn't a weapon. It was a small, blackened remote, its surface etched with symbols that looked like a military code. "Stay down," she hissed, her voice devoid of the frantic edge it had held moments before. "If you value your life, you need to stop looking at me like I'm a stranger. You know exactly who I am, and you know why those men outside aren't just looking for a trespasser." She was right, but it was a truth I had spent 2 decades burying under layers of denial and isolation. The logging mill incident wasn't just a fire. It was the epicenter of a massive, illicit operation involving dangerous packages with prohibited substances and a network of powerful people who didn't exist on any public record. I was just a kid then, a local boy who had seen a truck arriving at the mill in the dead of night, carrying crates that were never meant for construction supplies. I had run away before I could see who was driving, but someone had seen me. I had been relocated, given a new name, and spent my entire adult life waiting for the past to finally catch up. A heavy, muffled thud hit the porch, followed by the sound of boots, professional, heavy, rhythmic steps that didn't belong to a hiker or a lost traveler. My pulse roared in my ears. I looked at the woman, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, and I realized the terrifying depth of the rabbit hole I had fallen into. She hadn't stumbled upon my cabin by accident. She was the final piece of evidence, and I was the final witness. "They aren't here for me," she whispered, her gaze drifting toward the heavy trapdoor in the corner of my living room, the one leading to the storm cellar I'd built for emergencies, the one that hid the files I'd kept all these years. "They're here for the ledger, the one you stole from the site before the flames took everything." My grip on the floorboards tightened. How did she know about the ledger? I hadn't even told my own shadow about those pages. She lunged forward, not toward the door, but toward me, grabbing my collar with surprising strength and dragging me toward the hidden latch. "Open it," she commanded. "If we don't get underground, the Service of Internal Security won't even find enough left of us to perform an autopsy." She was referring to the specialized unit tasked with covering up the organized scheme, the very people I had spent 20 years running from. As I scrambled to lift the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor, a deafening blast rocked the entire cabin. The roof groaned under the weight of something heavy, a grappling hook hitting the shingles. Heavy boots began to stomp directly above our heads, the ceiling boards bending under the pressure. I threw the hatch open, black darkness yawning beneath us, but as I turned to pull her down with me, I stopped cold. She wasn't looking at the door anymore. She was holding a small silver drive, the exact twin of the one I had hidden in the cellar, and she was smiling, a slow, chilling arc of the lips that lacked any warmth. "Thanks for the hospitality," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of chilling, detached authority. "But you were never the witness, were you? You were the insurance policy." She shoved me hard, sending me tumbling into the pitch-black void of the cellar, and as I hit the concrete floor, I watched the trapdoor slam shut. In the final second of light, I saw her pull a concealed communication device from her collar and speak into it. "Target secured. He has the coordinates to the secondary site. You can move in now." The lock clicked, and I was plunged into total, suffocating darkness, with the heavy, rhythmic thumping of boots directly above me growing louder and more certain, and the realization that the woman I had saved was the one who had led the wolves directly to my door. I scrambled to my feet, groping in the dark for the emergency light, but as my fingers brushed the wall, I felt something cold and metallic pressing against my neck. Someone was already in the cellar with me. The air in the cellar turned from stagnant to arctic as the metal pressed firmer against my jugular. I held my breath, every nerve ending screaming in protest, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The person behind me didn't move, didn't breathe. They were a statue of malice. I dared to turn my head just an inch, and the cold steel bit into my skin. "Don't," a voice hissed, a low, gravelly tone that sounded like grinding stones. It wasn't the woman. It was a man, and the scent of rain and gun oil clung to his jacket. "She played you like a symphony, didn't she? The perfect damsel, the frozen victim. She's been dead to the world for 20 years, just like you thought you were." I couldn't help it. The irony escaped me in a strangled laugh. "Who are you? Another one of her colleagues?" The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I'm the one who should have ended this in '94. My name is Miller, and I've been waiting for her to lead me back to this cabin for a very, very long time." He eased the pressure slightly but didn't remove the weapon. Above us, the floorboards groaned as the heavy boots continued to pace. The woman upstairs was speaking again, her voice muffled through the wood. She wasn't just talking to someone, she was issuing orders. I heard the distinct sound of a weapon being readied, the metallic slide of a mechanism locking into place. The group had arrived in force, and they weren't interested in taking prisoners. "She thinks you have the ledger," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm raging outside. "But you're smarter than that. You burned the physical copy years ago, didn't you? You memorized the network, the names, the locations. That's why you're still breathing." My mind raced. He was right. I hadn't kept the paper. I had burnt it to ash in the very fireplace where I'd found her shivering only minutes ago. My brain had become the only repository for the organized scheme's darkest secrets. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just an insurance policy. I was the map. "Why tell me now?" I hissed, finding my courage in the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Because we have 5 minutes before they realize there is no ledger," Miller said, moving his hand away. I spun around, flicking on my lighter. The flame sputtered, illuminating a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Deep scars, tired eyes, and a look of profound resignation. He wasn't a criminal. He was a veteran of the Internal Security Service who had been purged from the ranks decades ago, a ghost hunting other ghosts. "We need to get out of here," Miller commanded, nodding toward the back wall of the cellar. There was a hidden drainage pipe, narrow and choked with debris, that led to the mountainside. "But she's blocked the main exit. She's waiting for us to try the hatch." Suddenly, the pacing above stopped. Total silence descended, heavier and more ominous than the storm. Then, a low, rhythmic tapping started on the floorboards directly over our heads. It wasn't random, it was a pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. An SOS. Or a signal. "That's not her," Miller whispered, his eyes widening. "That's an override code. Someone else is here. Someone who isn't part of her group." Before I could ask what he meant, the heavy trapdoor above us didn't just open. It was blown off its hinges, a blinding flash of white light flooding the cellar. I shielded my eyes, reeling from the sudden sensory overload. Through the hazy, swirling dust and the smell of ozone, a figure descended the ladder. They weren't wearing the tactical gear of the others. They wore a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped tight around their face, and they held an item I recognized immediately. The original, weathered photograph of the logging mill, now stained with fresh blood. The figure stepped into the light, and I nearly collapsed. It was the woman from upstairs, but her clothes were shredded, and her face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She didn't look like a predator anymore. She looked like someone who had just escaped a slaughterhouse. "You have to run," she gasped, stumbling toward us, her hand clutching her side. "The men upstairs, they aren't the ones I work for. They're cleaners, and they just realized I've been compromised." She collapsed at my feet, and as the dust settled, I saw the true horror of the situation. Behind her, Framed by the gaping hole in the ceiling, a tall, shadowy figure stood at the edge of the opening. They weren't armed with a standard weapon. They were holding a glowing, pulsating electronic device, a localized pulse emitter. "It's not just us," Miller whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. "They aren't here to retrieve anything. They're here to sanitize the entire mountain. They're triggering a mountain-wide blackout to cover a total erasure." The device in the stranger's hand hummed, a sound that resonated in my very bones, and suddenly, every light, every shadow, and every heartbeat in the cabin seemed to sync with its frequency. The stranger looked down at us, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that they were wearing a mask identical to the ones the men in the mill had worn 20 years ago, the symbol of the organized scheme, staring at me with hollow, artificial eyes. The stranger raised the device, and the cellar walls began to vibrate, the concrete starting to crack as if something massive was shifting beneath the mountain itself. "You were never supposed to see the end," the figure said, their voice synthesized and cold. "But you're the only ones left who remember the beginning. Time to let the mountain reclaim its secrets." The humming sound deepened until it wasn't just a noise. It was a vibration that rattled my teeth and made the very air feel thick, like liquid lead. The concrete walls of the cellar were spiderwebbing with cracks, chunks of mortar falling like rain as the mountain seemed to groan in protest under the weight of the pulse. Miller didn't hesitate. He tackled me toward the narrow drainage pipe just as a secondary, more violent pulse ripped through the ceiling. The cabin above us didn't just collapse, it seemed to disintegrate, the wood and stone pulverized into fine dust by the sheer intensity of the emitter. We tumbled into the dark, slick tube, the sharp edges of rock tearing at our clothes. Behind us, I heard the woman, the one who had played me for a fool, scream, but it was cut short by a sound like a vacuum imploding. Then, silence. The absolute, heavy silence of a grave. "Don't stop!" Miller bellowed, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "If that emitter hits its full charge, the collapse won't just be the cabin, it'll be the entire slope." We crawled for what felt like hours, the air thinning, the smell of damp earth replaced by something metallic and scorched. Finally, we burst out into the biting cold of the mountainside. The storm had died down, replaced by an eerie, unnatural stillness. I looked back at the crest of the hill where my cabin had stood only moments ago. There was nothing left but a jagged, glowing crater, the ground still vibrating with a low-frequency hum. The cleaners were gone, but the forest around the clearing had been flattened, the trees snapped like matchsticks, pointing away from the center of the blast. Miller pulled me behind a boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "We are out of time. They know we survived the initial sweep. That pulse was calibrated for a lethal radius, and the fact that we're still standing means their tech is failing or they miscalculated. Either way, they'll be back with ground units to finish the job." "Who are they?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Who has that kind of power? The Internal Security Service doesn't operate like this. This wasn't a law enforcement operation. It was a military-grade scrubbing of a crime scene." Miller looked at me, his eyes reflecting the pale, dying light of the stars. "That's the thing, kid. It's not a secret agency. It's the remains of the group, the ones who didn't die in that fire 20 years ago. They didn't just hide, they integrated. They're in the government, in the banks, in the companies that provide the power grid for this entire state. They've been waiting for someone to leak the existence of the ledger, and you were the bait." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But I never told anyone. I never even wrote it down." "They didn't need you to talk," Miller said, reaching into his own coat and pulling out a small, jagged piece of glass, a fragment from my living room window. He held it up, and I saw a tiny, blinking light embedded in the surface. "They didn't need the ledger. They needed to see who you'd contact when you were pushed. You were the canary in the coal mine, and I was the trail they were waiting for you to lead them to." My heart stopped. You? But you said you were trying to save me. I was, Miller whispered, his voice thick with regret. But I've been under constant surveillance for years. By reaching out to you, by coming to this cabin, I didn't save you. I marked you as a high-value asset, worth extracting or executing. Before I could process the betrayal, a blinding spotlight swept across the mountainside, cutting through the darkness like a surgical blade. It pinned us against the rock face. A voice boomed from the sky, not a person, but a drone, hovering silent and predatory above the tree line. Subject identified. Target termination authorized. Deployment of containment field active. A high-pitched whine began to emit from the drone, and I felt my muscles lock up, a paralyzing current running through the ground beneath my feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Miller tried to lunge for his sidearm, but his limbs failed him, his body hitting the dirt with a thud. I looked up at the drone, and on its side, painted in fading, familiar red ink, was the symbol of the logging mill. But then, the drone suddenly shuddered. A rhythmic, rapid-fire clicking sounded from the shadows of the trees to our left. Sparks showered down from the drone as it spiraled, its motor dying, and it crashed into the snow 100 yards away. A figure emerged from the tree line, cloaked in heavy camo, holding a weapon that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap. It wasn't one of the cleaners. It was someone I hadn't seen since the day I fled the mill. The figure lowered their mask, revealing a face I had seen in my nightmares for 20 years. My father, who had been officially declared dead in the 1994 fire. He looked at me with eyes that were cold, calculating, and absolutely unrecognizable. "You were never the insurance policy, son," he said, stepping into the light, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "You were the catalyst. And now, you're finally ready to take your place in the network." He kicked Miller's gun away, pulled a heavy, weighted collar from his vest, and stepped toward me, his shadow stretching long and terrifying across the snow. "Welcome home. It's time to start the cycle all over again." The realization hit me harder than any physical blow could have. The man standing before me, the man who had supposedly perished in the flames of the logging mill, was the architect of the very nightmare that had defined my life. He didn't look like a grieving father. He looked like a man who had spent decades meticulously building a throne out of the ashes of our family's history. "You're alive," I whispered, the words feeling alien in my dry throat. "You were the one managing the network from the start. All those years, the tracking, the fear, the isolation, it was all part of your design." My father didn't flinch. He walked closer, the crunch of snow beneath his boots sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. "Fear is the only currency that never devalues, son. I needed you to be forged in the fire of pursuit. A person who hasn't been hunted can never truly understand the value of control." He gestured to the fallen drone, his movements fluid and rehearsed. "That drone wasn't sent to kill you. It was sent to test if you had finally reached the breaking point. If you were ready to abandon the morality that has kept you weak all these years." Miller, still paralyzed by the drone's pulse, wheezed from the snow, his eyes darting between us. "He's a monster, kid. Don't listen to a word he says. The ledger wasn't just a list of names. It was the protocol to shut down the organized scheme for good. If he's here, it means he's desperate. He lost the leverage he had over the internal security teams. He needs you to unlock the backup encryption." My father laughed, a sound that lacked any warmth. "The encryption isn't in a computer, Miller. It's in his genetic code, tied to the memories of that night. He saw the ledger, and he saw the override codes. It's all burned into his subconscious, waiting for the right trigger." The world seemed to sharpen. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and realized the truth behind the organized scheme. It wasn't about the prohibited substances or the money. It was about the power to rewrite history itself, to erase anyone who didn't fit the vision of a silent, controlled society. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the small, jagged piece of glass Miller had recovered from the window. It wasn't just a tracker. It was a data link node I had swiped from the woman's gear while she was distracted in the cellar. "You think I'm just a repository for your secrets," I said, my voice gaining a newfound, cold steadiness. "But you forgot one thing about a hunted person. We spend every single second learning how to turn the trap back on the hunter." I pulled the note out, but instead of handing it over, I smashed it against the rock. Simultaneously, I triggered the override on my phone, the device I had secretly modified using the schematics I'd reconstructed from years of obsession. I hadn't just been hiding in the mountains. I had been building a localized jamming field, a trap I had prepared for the exact moment the past finally found me. The air around us began to shimmer. My father's expression shifted from arrogance to sudden, sharp confusion as his own communication device began to smoke and spark. The forest around us erupted in a high-frequency screech, not a weapon, but a broadcast. I was uploading every single file, every name, and every location associated with the network to the Internal Security Service's public servers. "What have you done?" my father roared, reaching for his weapon. "I'm finally letting the world see the ghost in the machine," I replied. The forest was suddenly flooded with the sound of approaching sirens, real ones, not the silent, sinister approach of the network's cleaners. The Internal Security Service had been closing in on the signal for days, but they needed a confirmed transmission of the encrypted data to move against someone as high-placed as my father. The gamble had paid off. My father looked at the horizon, where the lights of arriving tactical units began to cut through the night, then back at me. He looked not defeated, but strangely relieved, as if he had finally succeeded in creating an opponent worthy of his legacy. He dropped his weapon. "You really are your father's son," he said, his voice barely a whisper before the security teams swarmed the clearing. As they dragged him away, his face unreadable and composed, the nightmare finally began to dissolve. I helped Miller to his feet, my hands finally steady. The organized scheme was over, its leaders exposed, its network dismantled by the very light it had tried to kill. I looked at the crater where my life had been, then toward the road, where the sunrise was finally breaking over the mountains. I didn't know what the future held, or if the scars would ever truly fade. But for the first time in 20 years, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was just quiet, and it was mine. I turned my back on the mountain and walked toward the light, leaving the ghosts of the past exactly where they belonged, buried in the ashes.